So this one is about rightly ordered loves. I don't know if that really is clear on what I'm going to talk about. What do y'all think I'm going to talk about?
Like how to love.
Okay.
My idea, when I read that, I thought it was about relationships and how our relations as Christians should be.
Okay.
Not just
So relationships. Okay. The discipline of love.
Right, that's what I'm thinking.
What do you think?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. Cool.
I was thinking about what we talked about last night.
Okay.
Kids.
Okay.
About my children. My two boys I told you were staunch atheists.
Okay.
And my love for them is not going to get them to heaven. But
Okay.
some way to let God take over and me quit trying to force them to
Okay. All right. Well, I hope I touch on maybe a little bit of what y'all are thinking about, but I think that the relationships that we have, whether or not we are, knowing whether or not they're loving, or the discipline of how to love, and I think it's important for us to understand. And I think that our culture has a problem with defining what love is. I think our culture has a problem with actually truly loving people. And so I'd like to offer 3 problems, okay? So 3 problems in our culture, and we can just talk about that first, because I think we should understand the problems that I'm setting up, so ask questions if you want. And the first one is, I think our culture has an undisciplined love and a more collectivist love. And so I quote unquote love. Okay? And so let me give you some examples of that. You might have heard this expressed, that nuclear families are not good, or we need to get away from the nuclear family. Do you know what the nuclear family is? Mother and father and children, and then or families, with grandparents too. But the nuclear family is something that is not good, and so that was expressed by groups like BLM, like Black Lives Matter, and I know it's also been expressed by influential public school advocates, or like the teachers unions, because they've said things like they don't believe that you should direct your children's education. Like they don't believe that your parents should have say over your education. There's people who believe that, and they're pretty influential. What are you going to say?
Well, the whole thing about the nuclear family, I'm sorry, I love these topics. I feel like you and I see very, very eye to eye on a lot of things. The whole nuclear family thing, and that brought up by the Black Lives Matter community, isn't just being brought up for equality. It's brought up for culture. That's why so many fathers in the Black communities are leaving. That's why they're declining so many. That's why so many children are being raised by only mothers and grandmothers. That's why so many families are splitting up, because it has nothing to do with equality. Sometimes it does, but it has nothing to do with equality and more of culture. So I mean, I don't know how to put this into words to sum it up all the way, because I could go on this for hours. But I mean, it has more to do with the fact that not everyone's perfect, and their families who are different. I completely agree with that. But that, and not every family has.
So, as a
It doesn't show the fact that they have like all these family figures in your lives, but it also you shouldn't say that's what it should happen. You should have only one parental figure. You should only have one grandparent, if any. You should have no parental figures in your life. So it has nothing to do with equality, which is what they think they're doing. It's more having to do with culture. It did end up with equality, and it did start off with equality. I believe in that. But it really started off with equality, and then it just ended into, well, we should only be raised by one parent. That's the norm. We shouldn't have grandparents in our lives. That's the norm. So that's what I believe in. That's just me.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that our culture, I think, is trying to take decisions away from parents. They're trying to disempower parents, and so I think that's a problem. There's also undisciplined love in terms of, you've probably heard the command to love your neighbor be used to just hammer down on everybody. I mean, just used for all kinds of things, like wear the mask because you're supposed to love your neighbor. Take the vaccine because you're supposed to love your neighbor. What else? Cancel your church because you're supposed to love your neighbor. Lockdown because you're supposed to love your neighbor. It's like, so we have, from what I can tell, a very undisciplined understanding of what loving your neighbor is. Give up your rights because you're supposed to love your neighbor, And it's like, well, so if I give up my rights, then that means my neighbor has to give up their rights, and that's not very loving my neighbor, right? If I have to do this or that thing that doesn't actually work, then I'm not living by truth, and so I'm not really loving my neighbor if I'm doing something false or if I'm being overbearing, So so we have, what I've seen is an undisciplined version of what love means, and so another problem. We have a culture that likes to hate our enemies. Do you guys see that? So I think that our culture is promoting hate of enemies. Okay, so here's what I have. I know that there have been, in the past couple of years, actual political hit lists. Okay?
Yeah.
So I don't know if this guy wants me to tell about it, but I've heard from somebody that there was a political hit list actually distributed in Raleigh about Christian organizations that that they wanted to disrupt. Okay, and so I've heard about that. Of course, I just mentioned the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. They like to list Christian organizations as hate groups, and so they try to disrupt those groups. Have you guys ever heard of Antifa? Okay. They believe that they're anti-fascist as their whole thing, but I think they're really just sort of anarcho-communists. And so you have groups.
CIA.
Sorry, it's called the CIA. So you have these groups that, and Antifa, they have a large presence in Portland and all over. Some of the stuff going down in Atlanta right now is because of Antifa, and so they have killed people. They have destroyed just many properties and businesses.
Took over the police department in Seattle.
Yep. So a lot of the they had the Chad or something.
Welcome to our new home.
Yeah, and so when the riots of 2020 went down, Antifa was definitely in and among those riots.
January 6th.
I think I've heard that they were a part of that as well. So it's their whole purpose is to hate their enemies, and like they've been known to attack Christian groups that want to get together to worship in, like a park or something, like a public space. And so, but you have Antifa groups or other groups like that want to disrupt just Christians freely worshiping their God in a public park, and probably have already, and they've done the paperwork so that they can reserve the spot and everything, And so so you have these groups that are committed to hate, and so the reason that you haven't, did you hear of Antifa or no?
Yeah.
Okay, you have, but I'd say the only reason that we don't hear of them more is because the powers that be, the media, they don't talk about it because they may not agree with it, but it's like a
They're political powers. They don't need them right now.
right.
Wait till the next election, they'll be back.
Because they've done a lot of violence, but you've probably heard of Proud Boys, who have maybe done some violence too. But which one have you heard about more? probably most people have probably heard about the Proud Boys more than Antifa, but who has done more damage and more evil? Antifa. And so that you see this,
Who's the leader?
promoting. I don't know, but you see this promotion or this allowance of evil and hating your enemies if it serves your cause. And so Christians, we believe that hating our enemies is wrong. Yep.
Just going back on on the media, it just shows how corrupt the media and politics are, because if I always say this, if it was a different religion, if it wasn't Christians being targeted, there would be so much more attention on it. If it were Muslims, if it were Hindu or whatever, they would have so much more attention. But since it's Christians, we're just always the ones that are being attacked.
Right.
But no one really cares because we're the ones posed as the ones that are doing the evil, especially white male Christians. They're the ones that are the worst in the world. They're the ones that are doing the evil. Because we're the good in that. So that sin and that evil in the world is attacking us because they know that we're the reason, we're the good guys. We're the disciples of Christ. So that's why when we're spreading out our gospel and the truth, they want to stop us. So that's why Christians are being attacked and no one's understanding it. That's because the sin's trying to oppress them. Yeah. And that's the problem with media, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so that's actually a really good segue into the last example of hate for enemies is I believe that we, we punish skin color for the evils merely associated with that skin color. We punish people for their skin color because of evils that we associate with their skin color. And so I think we've seen that. Or we affirm certain skin colors because of certain virtues that we associate or certain oppressions that we associate with that skin color. Instead of actually treating people as individuals, we treat them together. And so we have to hate one group of people in order to, quote unquote, love another group of people. Or we have to give privileges to one group of people so that we can knock down the other group of people. So, yes, which is partiality. That's right. Yeah, and so that's a problem. That's hating our enemies. Okay, so another problem that we have is so-called tolerance, which is not really tolerant, I don't believe, and what we also now call affirmation. Okay, so you know that we have to affirm everybody, and you have to be tolerant of everybody. But we believe that I believe that the way our culture is doing that is not really being tolerant, and because we're having to affirm everybody's beliefs, we're not able to have our own beliefs. Okay, so for example, the world, our culture doesn't really tolerate a Christian that disagrees with gender confusion or orientation. So if we believe that those things are wrong, or that we can live, we can choose to repent of those things, there are people that won't tolerate us because of that. Okay, so we have a skewed version of what love is. We talk about hating our enemies. Our culture promotes that, and our culture promotes a skewed or perverted version of tolerance and affirmation. And so, so what I want us to think about is love is not what makes you feel good or what makes someone else feel good. Love is disciplined feelings and actions that glorify God and benefit others according to God's order. So, like, for example, Dr. McCuddy, he said that I think he quoted something from the Bible where it said, what they meant for evil, God used for good. Okay? And so when I say benefit others, I mean benefit others according to God's order. They may not feel benefited, but if it's according to God's order, then they are benefited by that love. And so when I say that we ought not to love people merely by what makes them feel good, I'm saying that sometimes I see people, quote unquote, loving others by merely placating their misguided feelings, by just playing along with misguided feelings. And I'm saying I don't believe that's love. Okay? So, here's a good example. Let me just read 1 Corinthians 13, a really good example of what love is. So, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. So, when it says it does not insist on its own way, we talked yesterday about the traditions of men and having our own feelings. That would be our own way. Okay? But what does it promote is truth. It rejoices in truth. And so that's what, if there is no truth, there is no true love. So true love has truth. Okay, so if you think about it that way, true love has truth in there. So I want to highlight a few things. And what time are we ending this?
11:30.
11:30. Okay, all right. Well, thanks for. See ya. Are you coming back later? Okay. All right. Good to see you. Okay, so I'm going to get into some examples here. Okay, so we're going to talk about love for our family, church, and neighbor. We're going to talk about loving our enemies. We're going to talk about loving Jesus and loving righteousness. And we're also going to talk about, we're going to end with how Jesus loved the world. Okay? So lots of topics here.
I just have one question.
Sure.
So, when you say that, like, love relies on the truth, right?
Yeah.
So, would that mean that tough love is literally just love? There's no such thing as tough love, because tough love is working with the truth and, like, giving people what they don't want to hear, but you do it out of love because you want them to know the truth. So that means that tough love is really not a thing, it's just love.
No, yeah, I like the way you're thinking. I'm okay with the tough love phrase. I'm okay with that. Because I think because the Bible talks about how there's an easy way to love. If you just love your friends, I mean, that's easy. Everybody can love their friends, right? But what we'll get to is loving enemies later. That's hard. That's tough. Okay? So there's a form of tough love, but I know that that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about, okay, what if you have to go up to your friend and rebuke them?
Yeah.
Or, I mean, when I say rebuke, I don't mean harshly. Obviously,
Right.
I'm talking about in a friendly way. That's tough, because you're like, I could ruin my friendship, and I really like this friendship, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you're hoping that they're going to be real Christian and repent of that sin. And so, but that's, or like a parent, which I guess is a better example to use because I'm about to talk about family. A parent disciplining their child,
Right.
that could be tough love. I think that's okay, because that's the love that's the hardest to implement. Right? Because the love that risks a relationship, that's the hardest. That's one of the hardest loves to implement. So I think I'm okay with calling hard to do love that tough love. Yeah, I'm okay with that, because I think that's a reality. And so I think we should recognize the loves that are hard to do,
Right.
so that we can at least acknowledge that and
Right.
work hard to do them. So yeah, no. I like rethinking phrases
Yeah.
but I think that's a good one, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but thanks for asking
Yeah, no,
that.
thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so this is what I'm trying to do here is, and there's so much, and we'll just go as far as we can, but and I do want to end with the gospel, though. I want to tie all this in to the gospel, but I want to give an example of how God orders things. And so love isn't just this vague concept of being nice. Love is an ordered way of living. Like I said, an ordered way of feeling and doing as well. Because you are supposed to feel love. I mean, I think that when Jesus did loving things, it talks about him having compassion. I mean, these are real things. So if you only do and you don't feel, I think that's probably a bad thing. That's not going to do you well in the long run, because I think you should develop feelings of love. But I think that it should mean that you do the right things as well. So let's talk about loving family, church, and neighbor. Do you guys think that there's an order to who we should love the most or love first? Do you think there's an order?
I was taught that, like, in terms, it's like you always love God first, and then
Okay.
it's your family,
Okay.
and then like any part of your family, and then like your friends,
Mhm.
and then or like authority and your friends and like stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's a great, so you already have this idea of, there's good obligations that we
Right.
should have. There's good hierarchy of loves, right? Good order of loves, or rightly ordered loves.
I was taught differently. Sorry, I was taught you love everyone the same. I mean, not has a different part in your heart. Like, I love you differently than I love my parents.
Yeah.
But I love you. I love them the same. Like, I love you the same amount. Okay? Well, not the same amount. You know. I love everyone.
Uh-huh.
I don't hate anyone. I love everyone.
You love everyone.
Even if I don't get along with everyone. I root. But there are people that I follow. Like, if my parents told me to do something and you told me to do something different, I'd follow my parents.
Right.
If God told me to do something and my parents told me to do something differently, I'd follow God.
Yeah.
But I do that in the most respectful way possible because I love everyone the same. But there are different people that I respect and follow in that list. So the list that you have, that's the same list I have.
But just in terms of like authority
Yes.
over your life.
But I love everyone the same.
Okay.
It's not like who I would love first.
So we're still talking a little bit about hierarchy of loves. Okay. I don't think you're actually far off from one another
Yes.
with the reality of living out. I think maybe you're describing it differently, but you're kind of talking about
Yeah.
living the same way.
Right.
Yep.
I was going to say that before I became a parent,
Yep.
I knew that my mom and dad was always going to be the top of my life. But then when I became a Christian, which was in 2008, so I'm still kind of doing the walk, I realized that without Jesus, there's no such thing as love, because he is love.
Okay.
But then when I had my children, which I got 4 and 12 grandbabies, but my children have brought a new verse of love in my heart, because I didn't know I could possibly love somebody like I did my children. But then when I started comparing myself, this is wrong, I should be loving Jesus more than my children. And then I started really I learned what of love means, like your friends. Like, I don't even know y'all, but I love you because you're Christians, you're brothers and sisters in Christ as I am.
Yeah.
And I have love for you. But for God to give Jesus up as his son for our sins, that love I could not do.
Right.
I couldn't give my child up. I can't. I was saying earlier, my 2 boys are both atheists. I'm not giving up. I can't give up on them. My 2 daughters both are saved. And they won't give up on the brothers, but it's not that I love my daughters more, but because I'm sure of where their destiny's going to be when they're dead, And that's another thing I heard you say earlier. We don't die again. We've already died. When we got saved, we died. There's no other death for us. We just go straight to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord, correct? So we don't die again. It's just a little body thing. So that's what I was looking at, is the amount of love you can have for someone. As your neighbors, you love them, but as your kids, it's a whole different ballgame, because then it's not just something you've created with your life. It's something that God put you in charge of. And that's why I am like I am about my boys, because I feel like I failed them miserably, because they're not saved. So something I have done wrong is what I keep thinking. But then, I was talking about last night about feeding the seeds. I want to feed my kids the seeds, and then hopefully till the soils where they can catch on and God nurture them, but it's hard to get your hands off the garden, you know? It's like,
Yeah.
I can't do it for them, but, you know, it's your kids. When it's your kids, you want them to have that kind of love for Jesus. They gotta learn to love themselves
Yeah.
first.
I absolutely love the way you worded everything you just said. I'm sorry, that was amazing. Okay.
Well, that's fantastic. We're doing great in here. So I've got an order here that I'll just read out, and then I'll try to defend with some verses. So I think that the Bible is has an ordered way of how we're supposed to love family, church, and neighbor. I think that first and foremost, we're supposed to love our spouse. So when we are married, our first, obviously, okay, so we're talking about loving God, okay? Right. But our first duty in this world is to whoever you are married to.
Yeah.
If you are married, so if y'all get married, then your first duty would be to your husband. Even when you have kids,
Yeah.
it's like the oxygen mask thing on the
Yeah.
airplane, okay? If that relationship isn't good, then that does not serve your children well.
Right.
Right? If your relationship with your spouse is not healthy, that does not serve your children well. So I think that our relationship with our spouse is a priority. I think that's the number one priority. I think that's a first importance in the love category. And I think obviously extending from there, children. And we're supposed to love our children. And we're supposed to love our children before we love other children. Okay, that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to look out for your children. I saw something about a quote-unquote debate from the Gospel Coalition on public schools and whether or not you should send your children to public schools. And obviously I think, lots of public schools in the country, lots of different styles.
Yeah.
Probably some good ones. There's definitely some bad ones, okay? So, and there's a lot of bad private schools and a lot of good private schools. Okay. I love all the different types of educational avenues and options. And I wish that we just have a really good thriving option of education systems that suit, each family, how they are operating. Okay. So, but this person was saying that we ought to not look out for our children over and above other children. Okay, that we ought to love our neighbor by sending our children to be part of the public school. And they gave reasons and stuff. And I just, it's okay to prioritize the health and well-being of your children over and above someone else's children because you are in charge of them. And God has given you that charge. Okay? So I think that there's an order to the love. And I think that after that, I think that you ought to still love your parents. And I think that's a love that God commands from the moment you are born. You ought to honor. Of course, there's going to be a time where you realize, what honoring is, and of course, but you're always supposed to honor your parents from till your death or their death. Okay, there's never a time where you're supposed to dishonor your parents. You're always supposed to honor your parents, and so that's a thing that, and like I said, whether or not you have a bad spouse or a good spouse, and of course I also made the difference of, I'm not talking about abusive spouse, I'm talking about good or bad spouse, right? Abuse is a different category. Good or bad spouse, you're supposed to live according to God's order with that spouse, okay? In the same way, if you're a child if you have a parent, you're supposed to honor, whether they're a good or bad parent. Again, abuse is a totally different thing we can talk about separately in a unique way, okay? But a good or bad parent, you're supposed to honor them, okay? And so I know people, I have friends that have had bad parents, but they made decisions to honor them, okay? And I know years down the line, you realize that decision to honor that parent has actually benefited them personally.
Right.
So you think that, well, I have to honor this bad parent. It's going to take so much out of me. It's not going to benefit me. But you know what? There's some times where you honor someone enough and you win them over. And that's such a blessing, because then your children are able to enjoy their grandparents, and maybe not in the best way. if they were a good parent, the relationship would probably be better, but at least the relationship is salvageable. At least the relationship has some meaning to it, and is a benefit. And so that's a good thing. And so just practically speaking, I've seen ways that even honoring bad parents can be beneficial in the long run. But even if not, it's an act of worship. And so if we honor our parents as an act of worship, whether good or bad, then that's a good thing to God. Because like you said, we love God first, and that's part of loving God. So all of this is under that. And then I think, loving family and loving church and then loving neighbor. I mean, all those are so important, but there's a certain order to it. And so I think that, so let's go, before we get too far into that, I'll just go ahead and throw out some verses so that we can see some of these backed up. So with the spouse, in Genesis 2:24, it talks about leaving father and mother and being one. Okay, so there's other verses in the Bible that point back to Genesis, talking about how that the husband ought to leave his father and mother and be one with his wife. Okay, so we talk about if the spouses, the husband and wife, are to be one flesh. I mean, that is so clear as day that they ought to be the first love for one another. Okay, and that relationship ought to be healthy, and they ought to prioritize that. So another thing in Deuteronomy 6:11, go ahead and open up to Deuteronomy. I think this is a good one. And if we take a lot of time on this, that's fine, because I think this is just such an important, even if we talked about this the whole time, I think it's such an important order of love.
6.
Yes, Deuteronomy 6. So this is a really important passage, and for the Hebrews, it's known as the Shema, and it is called the Shema because Shema means listen. And so you'll notice in Deuteronomy 6, it talks about, listen, Israel. Hear, O Israel. So listen. The Lord your God is one, and love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Yeah. And then it talks about how to raise your children. So can y'all look at Deuteronomy 6? Do y'all see those verses about how to raise your children? It should be starting in verse 4.
Yeah.
Okay, and then it goes into raising children and talks about teaching them God's ways when you are going about your day, when you're sitting down, going on your way, rising up. All the different ways that it's describing.
Yeah.
Just be teaching God's ways at all times, right? And intentionally in everything you do. And so we see that fathers and mothers are commanded to love their children well. And oh no, I have a link in here and I cannot click the link. So I forgot to. I forgot what the link was about. Oh no. Okay, we got plenty to talk about. Okay, so I think that over and over again in the Bible you see that you're one with your spouse and you are responsible for your children. And there's all kinds of. You said you read Proverbs, and there's so many Proverbs about how to raise children and how to live peaceably together. And Psalms. Yep, it's a wonderful thing to have as a focus in your life. So spouse and children, if we can't get those right, I think we have a higher chance of struggling with other relationships. When the Bible tells pastors, manage your houses well, so that you can manage the house of the Lord, or the church. And so, and I think that's a good way of, because you really need to practice that well.
You're teaching my story there, brother.
It doesn't mean that everything's going to be perfect. It means that you've got to do it well with what the way that God has made each of you. Okay, so here's something that's interesting. Sometimes in the church, we feel that we have to, it's a good thing to love every church member. It's a good thing to support the church members. But sometimes, and this is going to sound backwards, but I think the churches can be too quick to support members. Okay? Now let me defend what I just said. we're too quick to support church members because I think there's an ordered way that God would have us to live where he wants families to support one another first. Before churches are being, quote unquote, as Paul says, burdened by supporting, say, a widow or something. Paul talks about, and we can go to 1 Timothy chapter 5. I just did Timothy for this one. It's got a lot in here. But it talks about, somewhere in there, I think it's 7 and 8, it talks about how if there's a widow who needs help, we ought to encourage her family to help her first, because that is what pleases the Lord. So before, and I think, why does it happen that churches so quickly will go in to help other families? Because you know what? There's a lot of churches that are just so good at wanting to love people. And that's a great thing. That's a great thing. For as much of the complaints that I've heard about quote unquote Southern Baptist culture, complaints about how it's rotten or something, you know what? Man, so many churches will bend over backwards to love their members or just love people they've just met.
Yeah.
They will build ramps. They will collect meals for people. I mean, they will love. I mean, that's one of the things that I've seen in Southern Baptist churches. They will love people. Okay, but what I'm saying is, what I think we ought to do is do it in a biblical ordered way. And so, when we go and we do things for people before we give a chance for their families to support them, I think we're taking away a blessing from that family. I think we're taking away. It's like if you were just to give someone money without them working for it, you're taking away a blessing of them earning money for themselves. You're taking a blessing away from them supporting themselves. Yeah, and so in the same way, I think that it's a good thing to encourage families to help one another because that's how God has ordered it. I mean, how wonderful would it be for a family to serve one another and grow in love for one another, right? Yeah. I think that's part of when you commit yourself to someone and you sacrifice for them, there's something in us that just desires to love them more because we're helping them and we want to see them flourish. Yeah. And so I think that's a good thing. Yeah, that's a good thing. So I think that there's a way that what we ought to think is, families should help one another before the churches helps that family. Okay?
A lot of times, sorry to interrupt you, but
no, go ahead.
Sometimes the churches, you know how Jesus says, let the left hand know what the right hand is doing?
Sure.
So a lot of times, I think a lot of the churches around this, I'm not going to say this particular area, the Andrew and People area, but a lot of them will do something very nice, and then they turn around and tell you about it later. Let me tell you what we did.
Yeah.
If you're telling that for them to have like baby bottles,
yeah.
You take baby bottles, put all your change in, and have every church member do that, and you take that down to Tanya Nelson Baker, which is just Pregnancy Life Center.
Right.
So you can take those and fill it up each time and give it to them. So now you got a great idea. Except for you just told everybody what you're doing.
Yeah.
The blessing that you can do.
It's just like how I don't know where, but it says, the Bible says that when you pray, you are to pray with the door closed and you pray in secret because that's how God will reward you. You don't want, like, the lawmakers, they would pray out in secret and they would...
out in public.
Right, yeah, they would, yeah, that's what I meant.
Right.
They would pray out in public or they would dress like poorly when they were fasting because they wanted everyone to know that they were fasting. Right. But the Bible commands us that when you are fasting, you are to dress your best. You are to look your best so no one knows that you're fasting.
Oh, we're not supposed to put on our forehead?
Oh, I have no clue.
Yeah, that's why Protestants, we don't do the Ash Wednesday on our forehead. So I'm not going to be a huge stickler on that, but if people ask, like, why can't we do that in our youth group? I'm like, well, we believe that we shouldn't mark our foreheads when we fast. So,
And I think it's great that people can share their good ideas, like to help others. And that's what I think is great about this conference here, is because we're all learning from different aspects and different.
Yeah.
Like you and Shane and Mr. McCuddy are different, but y'all bring a lot to the table.
we're very different. I appreciate it. We're very different. I've enjoyed getting to know those guys. Okay, so I'll just make a little point here. So culture says that we need to care for our whole community equal to or above our family, or that the church must help everyone. But I think that families are commanded to help one another first. Okay, churches, when it talks about how people will know that we are Jesus' disciples by the way that we love one another, it's talking about we love one another within the church. And so we are commanded to prioritize the relationships within the church first. So
I like the way you said that.
mhm. So the church's primary function is not to make the community better. The church's primary function is to minister to one another, that we can repent and that we can grow in holiness and sanctification, and also support each other in the practical day-to-day as well. Because what I believe is that if a church does that, they have such a foundation and a platform to help the community.
Right.
Okay, and so I think that's a wonderful thing, because, and my last thing is that we ought to love our neighbor. We ought to love our neighbor. And but if we don't do the other ones well, I think the Bible is clear that if we don't get the first ones right, the other ones are going to be a lot harder to actually get right. So I think it's important to prioritize your responsibilities and do those well. Because if you don't, no one else will.
Right.
If you don't love your spouse well, no one else will, because they're not supposed to, right? If you don't love your children well, no one else will, because that's just not how things work in life. Because God has ordered you to love your children well. If you don't love your parents, who else are they parents to? You may have brothers and sisters, but you get my point. Is
Right.
there's only a few people that your parents are parents to, and if you don't love them well, they're not being served well. And your family, like same idea, right? But it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And so, but we do get to neighbor, and if we ignore loving our neighbor and we only focus on these things, then we're not doing it well either. So we have to do those things well so that we can love our neighbor well as well. And so, can y'all think of a good story about loving neighbor? What's the main story?
The Good Samaritan?
The Good Samaritan. Okay. The Good Samaritan loved his neighbor, wouldn't you say? So he said, "Who is my neighbor?" And then Jesus, the person asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus told them a story about the Good Samaritan. And do you remember who was involved in the story of the Good Samaritan? Okay, so you got rule makers,
Right.
Jewish rule maker, okay, and
It was the Samaritan.
well, priest, right, and then the Samaritan,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and so you've got these people, and the ones,
Samaritan was a Gentile.
Right.
right,
And they weren't
Yes.
allowed to touch or anything
so
or interact.
right, the people that Jesus talked about first were more of their kin, more of their loose family, right? So there was people that you thought would love the injured man, right? People that were important in the Jewish community, you thought they would love the injured Hebrew man. But then the person who actually loved the Hebrew man was the Samaritan, was the quote-unquote enemy of the Hebrew man. And God, and Jesus' point said, so who was the neighbor? Right? It was the Samaritan. It was the quote-unquote enemy was the neighbor. And so I think it's a good segue into loving our enemies, because I think that if we only love people that are easy to love, then then we're actually not completely loving. And so we're supposed to love our enemies. So like the Good Samaritan was a really good example of loving somebody who wasn't a spouse, children, parents, family, church, or what other people thought of as neighbors. The Hebrew man that was injured was the Samaritan's enemy, culturally speaking. But he still helped him, and so Jesus commends that. And can y'all think of another what about an Old Testament?
Eglon?
Who?
Ehud and Eglon?
Man, I'll have to be refreshed on that. Sorry.
Ehud was a Benjamite.
Okay.
He
Right.
assassinated Eglon the king
Okay.
for the rest of the Jewish people after they had already taken over the Jerusalem.
Okay.
His
All right.
kills.
I wasn't thinking of that one, but thank you.
Remember he stabbed him so hard that
The
house
disappeared. Yep.
disappeared.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting story.
I was thinking about Esther,
Okay.
how she still loved the king even though the king was persecuting her people,
Okay.
and she like sacrificed like her marriage to help her people. I don't know.
Okay. Sure. So there was still an order to the way that she spoke to him and a respect. Okay. Nice. Were you thinking of anything? Okay. I was thinking about Jonah and Nineveh. Because he hated them. I was thinking about Jonah and Nineveh, and Jonah didn't really like loving his enemies, did he? he was very upset about loving his enemies, but he was called to, and I think that's what we ought to do as well, is we ought to love our enemies. And I like that story because that's not a quote unquote nice story. The Good Samaritan, I mean, almost every people group most people can relate to that as being, that's a great thing. He's sacrificed his own finances and time and energy. That's a wonderful thing. Well, Jonah merely just preached, okay? And so, but we believe that is loving. We believe that it's loving to preach the truth. And so, the reason that Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh is because he knew that God would have mercy on Nineveh. The reason he didn't want to preach is because he knew God would relent and have mercy on Nineveh. And so that's why he preached like this, the shortest sermon ever. Yet 40 days and Nineveh will fall. And then Nineveh repented in sackcloth and ashes. So I know that we've been I know you may have heard about revivals recently. But what is a real revival is people repenting. And not necessarily being joyful, but repenting in their sorrow and receiving joy that God has forgiven them of their sins. And so you saw that. Now, Jonah wasn't happy about it, so it's not a good example of how we ought to react, but it was a good example of being called to love our enemies. And one of the ways that we can love our enemies. So, any questions on that? Anything? We're almost. We got like 7 more minutes. What do y'all want to tackle? Anything else? Ask me a question. Yeah.
I have a question on what you said earlier. The way I interpret it, and I'm probably wrong.
Okay.
The way I interpret it is when you said that family is family and church is church. The way I thought of it is that you should like keep to your inner circle almost. Like family is family, church is church, community is community, and then there should be no crossover.
Well, that's not true.
I didn't think so. I want to make sure I didn't misinterpret that.
No, because like in 1 Timothy 5, it talks about how before a widow is to be added to the roll of the list of the church of widows to help, her family is 5:14. Her family is supposed to support her first, and that's because that's what's good and right. families are going to have the strongest love for one another, and they should do that. But churches, if there's a widow, there's a widow and she's not able to be supported by her family, then if she is, you can look in there. It gives qualifications. If she is pure in heart and has loved the church and served, then you're supposed to add her to the list and serve her well and honor her. Yeah. Yep. But
Nine is the widow. They put the list of widows listed as over 60.
And
Yeah.
faithful to her husband and
Yeah.
well respected.
right. So
and
there's
brought up her children well.
So if she's done these things, then you had better support her. As
Yeah.
Paul's like, don't let her go hungry. Don't let her be like don't let her suffer. You had better support her, church. Like that's your job. Just like if she had children, it would be their job. Like you would, because it says that here's what Paul says is that if the family does not support their family, if the family does not support one another, they are worse than unbelievers. It says if the family does not support itself, they're worse than unbelievers. So if you were to not support your family, that's a stain. That's a very bad thing, right? But also, if the church does not support people who are truly in need, Paul says, are truly widows, without family, and that's a stain on the church because we're called to love one another. And
The widow calls Jesus to turn over some tables, didn't she?
who?
Didn't the widow have a lot to do with Jesus getting so mad that he said when the widow gave her last 2 pennies, or they have a different?
I think that's merging too.
Right. The 2 pennies had to do with like a widow.
The widow's mite.
She gave everything she had,
Right.
as opposed to others that wasn't given much at all.
Right.
She was.
Doing the opposite, was helping widows. The widow actually helped everybody else.
Yeah.
And left herself nothing to protect
Right.
herself with.
Yeah.
So you think that the church would be the ones that would help her as
Yes.
opposed
Right.
to take from her.
Yes.
I said that wrong, I guess, but
No. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Anything else? No. These are. I recognize that what I'm saying here is something that's not usually explained
Yeah.
in church, and because those passages are not usually preached.
Right.
Okay, so I understand that that there can be confusion or disagreements, and I understand that real life is sometimes a little more messy than the Bible will lay out good wisdom, and then real life will be a little messier.
Right.
So you got to use that good wisdom
In the right place.
and apply it as best you can, right? But I think it's just really important that we understand the good wisdom so that we can best apply it to messy life. So because what I want people to know is that what I like to preach is I try to preach good wisdom, but you know what? And there are some hard things that are law, right? But there's a lot of things that are just good wisdom that are a certain order, like when I said children ought to be raised by a mom and a dad. Like when I said that, that's just good biblical wisdom, right? And I understand life is way messier, okay? And so when life is messy, and that's not the case, what I'm not saying is that people ought to judge without, unduly judge somebody that isn't living according to the neat, orderly wisdom, okay? What I'm saying is that there are things that you can and cannot do. And then there's also good, orderly, wise ways of living. And so what I think is that I think we ought to be okay with preaching and hearing good, orderly, wise ways of living, and also giving Christians freedom of Christian conscience to live according to that as well. So it's going to be, for example, like the school system thing. I think there's probably good, orderly wisdom of how to train your kids and educate them, and I think a lot of families probably are going to do it way differently. and they're going to have very good reasons and great, uses of their Christian conscience to raise their kids the way. And I don't think we ought to judge, as long as they're using good godly wisdom. I don't think we ought to judge one another. So.
That's one of the hardest things not to do, is judge for their actions and stuff.
But I appreciate.
It's great the way you're pointing out that
Okay.
you got to have God centered around
Yeah.
everything the way you're
Right.
explaining
Right.
it. And if God's not centered, I think that's how my kids got the way they were supposed to until I was, say, 38 years old.
Yeah. Okay.
I can't blame nobody but myself because I wasn't centering my life around God. So,
Okay.
and you've really been helpful. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Appreciate it. Okay. Well, so we have literally 1 minute left, but can I just go ahead and just mention a couple things? So to be clear, and I didn't mention this very much, but we are supposed to love Jesus the most. Okay. And even if it looks like we're quote unquote hating others, and we're supposed to love Jesus so much that we're not tolerant of wickedness. Like we're not okay with wickedness. And so we're supposed to love righteousness and hate wickedness. And so there's an order as well. And I've got tons of verses here, but we really don't have time to go into all that. But if you've been reading Psalms and Proverbs, then you've seen that God hates wickedness. And also, God hates the evildoer. So it talks about God hates the sinner, hates the sin in the sinner, but he loves the people that are created in his image. Okay, we know that. So he loves the world, and the way that he loved the world was he sent his son as a sacrifice for the sins of those in the world. So even though he hates the sin and the sinner, he loves the world and his creation created his image, that he sent his son to die for their sins. So while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That's important because while he hated us, he loved us. It's kind of this. So going to a phrase that I'm not exactly sure how helpful it is, but hate the sin, love the sinner. I don't know. It's like hate the sin, love the person who's created in God's image. I think is what we should focus on first. Right. Love the sin, hate the sin, love the person created in God's image. I think that's what we should remember first and foremost, instead of focusing on the sinner. They're sinful, but we love them because they're created in God's image, and we're commanded to. And so I think that when we think about love, if I was going to end it, I had more time to go into all that stuff, but I really want to end it with, we need to love people because God first loved us, and there's an order to his love, and because there's one day that he will not love the whole world. There's one day that he will give his full wrath to the unrepentant sinners. There's one day where he will give his full joy to the repentant and those that are his sons and daughters. And but what we should want is whoever will to repent. That's what we should want. And so we should recognize that there is a hierarchy, and that God is not a universalistic God. He's not He's not. Did I use the right word? There's a time where his love will stop for some people, and they will only have his full wrath. Right. And so there's a hierarchy to his love, and so we should want everybody to repent. Okay, that's my rightly ordered loves.